Peeking is a fundamental skill that everyone needs to know to even be competitive in Valorant. But despite the fact that everyone knows what peeking is, very few players can do a perfect peek. It's kind of like throwing a punch. I know how to ball up my fists and punch something, but to a boxer like Mike Tyson, I would look like a complete idiot. So that's why in this video, I'm going to teach you my approach to peeking, ranging from rules to follow, conditions to consider, high-level insights, and an example breaking down how to clear an area based on everything we learned. If you're new here, I'm royalG, a high radiant coach and player that likes to share wisdom and help people improve. I also stream live coaching and rank gameplay if you want to come say hi sometimes. I've got timestamps placed for each section in this guide, so feel free to jump around. So to start things off, peeking is a pretty simple idea, but like I've said in my past video on counter-strafing, simple ideas are often the most overlooked and taken for granted. In truth, a strong peek has a lot of important conditions and rules that every player needs to understand. Even radiant players aren't completely aware of all factors, so to demonstrate, I think it's best if we start with an example of this. So here's an example of decent advice but wrong application from a radiant player.
You're peeking the wrong way in Valorant. Stop peeking like this. Instead, peek with your back against the wall. The reasoning behind this is because if you peek close to the wall, the enemy will see you before you see them.
As a heads up, I'm not trying to call him out. I think every player who has reached high ranks has insights to share and understands the game at a high level. I'm only trying to point out that even top players aren't perfect, and that means you can always improve more. To be fair, this was around 9 months ago, but just looking at the comments explains how little people understand peeking. None of the comments know why it's actually the wrong approach, but people can only say that it's not black and white. But it is black and white, if you understand peeking fully. So that's why throughout this video, I want you to think about why this tip isn't correct, and I'll give you the answer once we cover all the rules. Let's start with conditions. The first condition for a solid peek is having purpose. Peeking has a lot of different variations like jiggle peeking, wide swinging, standard peeks, and more. But at the same time, they're situational, which means that a good standard peek can't replace a good wide swing. Typically, people don't have problems understanding what each peek is mechanically, but more so when to use them. And that's where purpose comes in. For example, it doesn't matter if I make the perfect wide swing if an opera is holding from a distance. Instead, I should have jiggled or jump spotted to bait a shot. It also doesn't matter if I do the best jiggle ever if I'm behind a paper thin wall. It might have been better to just peek rather than try to bait a shot and end up being spammed. So you have to recognize that peeking is situational in most cases. I know this explanation doesn't solve your problem if you don't know how and why to peek, but hopefully as we go along, this idea stays in your head and you start picking up on different considerations a skilled player makes when they approach clearing an area or taking a duel. The second condition for a good peek is to have nothing messing with the peek itself. What I mean by this is being able to complete the peek without your movement being affected by obstacles. An easy example is I can't wide swing if I don't have the space to, or if I'm slowed by Sage. And if you heard me say before that movement affects aim, a bad peek also messes with your aim and crosshair placement. That's why you have to minimize obstacles. This plays a big role in what you can and can't do in certain areas of the map, and also helps you decide how you need to peek. Having the proper space to make a good peek is top priority. Because at the end of the day, a full mastery over peeking, or any mechanical skill in general, is to have complete control. Anyways, let's head into some rules and insights that shape how you approach peeking any angle. When it comes to rules, there's one thing that I always tell people first, and that's the fact that there will always be exceptions to a rule. But just because there are exceptions doesn't mean that a rule isn't useful in general cases. That's why I call these 95% rules, because even though they have exceptions, they are the backbone of how players master peeking. The first rule might seem really weird and also hard to imagine at first, but it's something that you need to do immediately in order to start building up a foundation for how to peek, which is to imagine your peek from the enemy's perspective. The reason you want to do this is because peeking is very situational, but the insight here is that most of the reasons are based on the enemy's perspective rather than on your own. The reason I say this is because as a peeker, you're the one initiating the fight, which means that you're also pushing into the enemy's space. If you don't know where the enemies are, you need to be able to imagine where the enemy could be in order to come up with a proper idea of how to peek it. If you can't imagine the enemy, imagine how you would hold it yourself. It's good to find out what a strong peek looks like from the enemy's perspective in order to understand how you should be peeking different angles. Keep this rule in mind because it applies to almost everything. The second rule is also a foundational rule that I call the T rule. This is because basically every angle you'll ever peek should be visualized as a T. So let's take Ascent B main for example. Assuming the enemy is holding from the entrance and you want to peek him as effectively as possible, you can draw a straight line from where he's holding to the contact angle where you would peek from. How you would want to peek that angle would be a line drawn perpendicular to that straight line, and that's why it's a T. The reason is because you're maximizing your relative speed which not only gets you to see the enemy faster, but gives them a harder target to hit. Another name that I used to call it was the right angle rule, because you peek at a right angle, so use whichever name feels easier to remember. Just as a quick aside, when I say contact angle, I mean whichever angle you're going to be peeking from. It's pretty important to identify what the contact angle is, because if you play around the wrong contact angle, then you might choose the wrong peek and misread the situation. So something that is really cool about the T rule is that it does more than just give you direction on how to peek an angle, but it also fixes something a lot of players often mess up, which is crosshair placement. If you know the angle you want to peek and can place your crosshair to the right of it and then peek, you're moving perfectly on that line, and you don't have to adapt your crosshair placement to diagonal movements and bad peeks. The third rule of peeking is pretty self-explanatory, but hard to implement well, which is to isolate fights. In most cases, it's not a good idea to wide swing into two people at once, for obvious reasons. But in order to prevent yourself from doing that, you need to have a good awareness of what angles you're peeking into. For example, if I peek wide into hookah, I'm open to a lot of potential gunfights. That's why it's important to isolate fights by peeking angles one at a time, and if there's an angle that you can't clear without running into multiple fights, it's probably better to use utility or gamble one and trust your teammate to trade. So I think something players often struggle with is that if they want to clear an area but also want to isolate angles, they feel that they have to walk peek into each angle since otherwise it would make noise. But what's really cool is that there's a threshold for movement before a step sound is made. Notice as I move here, I don't make any noise. This is super useful because I can clear an area without the risk of walking into the angle and giving an easy fight, while also being silent. It's hard to do for people still learning, so I would say that you should only consider this if you have time to practice it. When it comes to taking contact while peeking, a lot of players have a knee-jerk reaction of running away after a few bullets because it's the best way to stay alive. But what most players don't think about beforehand or during the duel is whether the fight is a good fight to take, or if the enemy is in a bad position, or if running away is even possible. This mistake can cause missed opportunities and also practices a bad habit of playing scared. When peeking, you need to be prepared to take a duel. Your goal is not to fire warning shots or trade some damage and info. Your goal is to take control. You should be 100% prepared to take a duel to the death if someone's challenging it. Unless your goal is to specifically bait out a shot or gather information, peeking means being ready to fight for space. So one thing that a lot of players might have heard before and also was shown in the example is a concept called angle advantages. The idea is that if you're further away from the contact angle, you're able to see the enemy faster than they can see you, which means you have an objective advantage. In truth, angle advantages are a very niche consideration in many cases, and it's nowhere as important as people give it credit for. A common mistake I see is that people treat angle advantages like law, and try to be as far as possible when peeking. But in reality, the difference is very minor, and instead, it might screw them over instead. In fact, in some cases, it's better to get very close to an angle then peek, because the relative speed is faster from the enemy's perspective. So this is where we return to the TikTok from the Radiant player. Do you know why the advice he gave is incorrect? Here's the answer. Because keeping your back against a wall breaks the T rule, ruins your movement, and can't overcome angle advantage anyways. If we draw a line from the enemy's perspective to the back wall, you might notice that if I were to peek against that wall, not only would I be unable to peek at a right angle, but it would also force my movement into peeking diagonally. This would 1. Ruin my movement input, 2. Make it easier for the enemy to hit me due to diagonal movement, which means slower horizontal speed, 3. Ruin my crosshair placement because I'm peeking diagonally instead of horizontally, and 4. Still be at an angle disadvantage. Instead, you should only factor in angle advantage to the extent that it won't hurt your peek, so you'll want to get a little closer and then peek because your movement won't be blocked by the wall. And that about wraps up my guide on peeking. So what's funny is that even though I spent many hours trying to write this guide and make it as informative as possible, there's still many other factors of peeking that I still haven't covered. Peeking is super nuanced and has so many factors. Let me know if this guide helped and what you think I should do next. With that said, take it easy.